Hello, everyone, and welcome to Unconvention 2021. For those of you who have just joined us, in the previous hour, we completed a fascinating masterclass with John from Billion Lives on using technology to build resilience in social impact organizations. We are now starting our second masterclass of the day, which is an interesting one on sustainable urban development and affordable housing by Aparna Das, Senior Advisor from Sustainable Urban Development Smart Cities GIZ. This session has been curated by a knowledge partner for affordable housing, Habitat for Humanity International. Meera Shiva, who's lead Shelter Tech Accelerator India, Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter, is also with us. So I hand over the floor to Meera now.
Thank you. Thank you for the great introduction and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this masterclass. As you may be aware, you may have seen our other sessions on the 17th and yesterday, two sessions, one masterclass on successful pilots and one on housing microfinance in the evening yesterday, and on 17th on 3D printing. So this is part of our series to do the knowledge partnership with the Will Grow, which is doing a great job by hosting Unconvention and bringing all these great speakers here. Habitat for Humanity, as you may be aware, is a non-profit with operations in 70 plus countries with the mission of housing for all. And as a part of it, the Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter works in a market-based solution, which is for profits, big and large, to create solutions that are scalable and just picked up by the market itself, and continue to create impact in creating affordable housing solutions for everyone. So in India, we have a reasonable presence working in various areas of the housing market systems. Basically, we work in skilling of the labor because quality and other aspects are important. Finance is one aspect, housing microfinance, as well as materials and innovation is another aspect, which is the Shelter Tech program that works with startups to come up with innovative solutions. So as a part of it, we are really happy to be introducing Aparna Das today for a very interesting session. She is quite the expert in to talk on this topic, and this is not a topic that you get to hear often from the very best of the best to talk about it. Aparna Das is an urban planning professional. She's a senior advisor with the GIZ India, and a role that she has been doing for the last 10 years. She worked as a deputy leader in the project Inclusive Cities Partnership Program, ICPP, jointly implemented by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs and GIZ India. This was 2014 to 18. In the recent years post this, she focuses on the contestation over land. So her focus area has been land, particularly in the urban areas, and equity concerns in cities. In her current role, she leads the housing and planning vertical of the Sustainable Urban Development in Smart Cities project. Her key sectors of expertise are affordable housing, municipal governance, basic urban services, urban planning, and issues about slum upgrading and linkages of these thematic areas with the land legislation and land tenure in urban areas. And she has over 20 years of experience with the different sector partners, both national, state, city governments, national, international NGOs, multi and bilateral agencies such as UNICEF, UNDP, DFID, India, and the World Bank. She has also worked, in multiple countries in Cairo, Egypt, and Bangladesh. She received her master's degree in urban development planning from Development Planning Unit, the DPU, in the University College London. She also received a fellowship called the Spurs Fellowship 2018 to 19 from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So her work in MIT focused on urbanization aspects in the global south and explored methodologies for efficiently distributing economic resources and achieving spatial justice in urban areas. So it's such an illustrious profile, and with the vast on the ground practitioners' knowledge as well. We really look forward to a very enlightening session with you, Aparna. Over to you.
Thank you, Mira. And good morning to all the people who are listening to me, or if I can see some participants here. So it's very difficult scenario nowadays that you are talking to someone whom you have not seen. So I have to go down and see, who are the participants. But good morning, and even if I'm speaking to very few people, I think I just want to put this out to people like Mira, Will Grove, so that we are asking the kind of raising a particular kind of a question. So thank you, and thanks for your kind words, and thanks for this nice introduction, because I sometimes feel that okay, one has done all this stuff, one is not in your day to day life, you just go on doing without accumulating it. So thanks for putting it all together. um, I'm just wondering that in the participants, I don't see anybody else than us. So shall we wait?
No, so Aparna, there is an online platform called
Oh,
Hubilo. So
okay,
from the
okay, okay,
Zoom, it is live streamed there, and
okay,
people will be there.
okay.
And because Zoom is a much easier platform for
Presentations, yeah,
yeah, for
yeah, yeah.
presentations.
Okay, sorry, I didn't understand that one, and I think it was explained to me, but I didn't catch it. So let me begin with the presentation. The first few minutes, I would just pause and tell you, who we are, what are we doing as part of GIZ in India. So, um, Arpan, can you please go to the next slide? Yeah. So I am part of this project called Sustainable Urban Development in Smart Cities. And the uniqueness of GIZ's way of working is that we work at three levels. We work at the national level, we work at the state level, and we work at the city level with a similar intensity. So I think that makes us a bit unique. And under this project, we are spread over Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Odisha. These are our main states, and we are also working in some part in Telangana. And at the national level, we partner with Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. So they are our key partners. So this particular project is being implemented in partnership with Bahua. Yeah, please. So this particular project, SUDSC, we call it Sustainable Urban Development in Smart Cities. It has three verticals: housing and planning, basic services and infrastructure, and it also has another component which is about SDGs. So as it happens in GIZ, we are on a rolling projects. So things gets added on to the new upcoming projects. So that's the reason this is structured in three verticals. Yeah, please. And this is just to give you that, the kind of landscape of partners we are engaging with. So we at the national level, we do engage with Niti Aayog, ministry, and we are also working with academia. We're also working with think tank organization. So our work is kind of a spread over the landscape of partners are quite a range. And these are the people, who support us in making our thought processes a bit more clearer, and also to build up the kind of portfolio that we want to identify for intervention. Yeah, please move on. This particular slide just gives you the landscape of work. So as we know that that the three verticals, and we have two cross-cutting vertical, which is about digital governance and also about participatory governance. I think these are the three verticals, and this two cross-cutting kind of it's a kind of a wide range, but they all ultimately targets tied up together. And it would be interesting that when I explain what affordable housing, the way we are now conceptualizing, this comes from learnings that we have it from wide range of work, from data driven governance to participation to sanitation, and our experiences with water and sanitation sector. So this is, I think, everything kinds of feeds into that. Yeah, please. So now the second, having said that, the position that we are coming from, what I'm trying to now do is that, just to give you a snapshot that, how the problem statement of affordable housing is being defined. So what exactly is affordable housing? What is it that we are missing? What is the problem if one has to kind of pinpoint on it? So this is just a kind of a fact. This is nothing to do with what my opinion is all about. The fact is that the housing shortage is among the EWS and LIG section. That accounts for 96% of the housing shortage. This is a sector, or this is a particular society, or the segment of the society that does not have access to housing. Now, if you again see on the right hand side, the if all these people are not having housing, what does it mean? Are they on the street? Are they like in the open? No. The problem is with the congestion. So 80% of the housing households are living in congestion, and that is, I think, a key. They may be living um, in a house that is not having adequate space, having not enough ventilation, not enough sanitation facilities. So the congestion is a big issue. It is not that we do not have houses. So that is one part of it. The second part of it, this is the area, this is the segment for whom the supply is not there. They are not being supplied for. Whereas, if you go to the other segment, the middle class or the upper middle class, this is where the housing is lying vacant. So, according to 2011 census, 2011 census, there are around 11 million housing is actually lying vacant. They are not used. So that means this has been used for speculation purposes or for some other kind of a reason. And how do we make use of it? Because these are like kind of an asset that is not being used. So this is the housing part of it. If you use the housing lens, you get this figure. But then if you take the land or the spatial planning lens, then what you see that in a city, it is hugely skewed when it comes to the spatial relation. So you have these spaces which are, your footprint for three people would be say around 1700 square feet, but large number of people would be living in a one uh, one bedroom house or a one room unit. So there is the 30%, if you kind of make an average, around 30% of a city would be living on 2 to 3% of the city's land. Now, that is another lens that we should be using constantly, that why certain areas so highly dense, so highly cramped, whereas other areas are kind of sparse. So within one city, you have Europe and sub-Saharan America, Africa living together, So you have these two standards together. So I think that is something that we need to also figure it out. That do you have shall we use the lens of spatial equity on the cities and then address the housing question from there, or shall we always use housing to address the housing issue, we entry from the housing question only? So that's something that I'm just leaving out in the open, that is housing question is only a housing question, or is it a land question? Can we extend it to the land question, or and can we extend it to the spatial planning question? That is what I think I would like to argue as I go on. Yeah, please, Arpan. Now, I think this crisis that we are going through right now has opened many, has really put many myths to the contestations. We always believed that all of us, all poor lives in slums. Now, if you see today, the slums are not empty. No, not that everybody has left. Then where were these people living before? So they were not living only in slums. They were living somewhere else also. They were living within their work areas. They were living in the periphery. They were living in hostels. They were living in many, many areas about which we do not even have a clue. The moment we start discussing urban poverty or urban poor, we get into the slums and then we start fixing the slum issue. I think there is much more to this discourse than just slums. So, the idea of informal settlements, finding a definition for informal settlements, something that is very difficult because accepting informality within the statutory discourse or a public discourse is a challenge. But I think with this pandemic, it has come wide in the open. There is no choice left to us to accept the fact that people do work informally and they also live informally. And if we want to take the route that we are now going to be formalize everything, we need to define the trajectory for formalization. This is not like either this or that. It is not that one fine day everything would be formal. I think there are layers in it and we need to recognize it. So this pandemic, I think, has proven that how the economy gets hurt and all these people who are accommodated within the city, they are not able to holding on with the city because they cannot pay more than 3 months of rent. They have they had to leave because they do not have the money and they do not have much stake in the city. They are here only for the economic and they go at the first strike. They just go off. So I think this has given us many clues. But when it comes to the housing question, there are two three things I think we need to now incorporate, and we have started incorporating it. Government of India should be encourage should be um, like this is I think that they really reacted quite in favor when they announced this affordable rental housing complexes, ARSC. I think it's in line, but this is too little and too late. But I think more people are living on rental, especially the urban poor, and they are not always living as families. They are living as single. So I think there are many varieties of it that needs to be taken care of. And access to water and sanitation and certain amount of optimum per capita space is important if we really want to fight corona or fight pandemics like this, because you cannot have such densified area which does not give you the basics arms and ammunitions to fight this pandemic. So we need to really address this issue. Yeah, please, Arpan. So, what we have done, we were as a team engaged in preparing the state housing policy. So, at the national level, we did give a kind of a guideline, and other state governments were preparing this affordable housing policy. They have already prepared before the central gave them this particular document, and there are discussions that happened, and at that time, the discussion was geared towards giving affordable housing a infrastructure status, and that has been achieved. So the moment you give it a infrastructure status, then the your loans and everything comes cheaper, and you also get subsidies. So I think the Mahua's effort to make it as an infrastructure, uh, giving that kind of a status to affordable housing has been achieved, and we also got a lot of um, financial kind of incentives for that. So this has been done. But I think that the discussion that again and again went is that is the subsidies that has been given on affordable housing, has it really reached the target group, or has it been gone to the, say, the lower middle class and the upper middle class, or the developers. So I think that discussion, I would like to get into it, that, for whom are we doing, and is it being really reaching the target group? Yeah, please. So there has been a lot of discussion about, how do you define affordable housing? I think that is something within the researchers, a big debate and a big discussion. And then there's a Deepak Park committee report that says that, it should be three times of the earning. And then there is this another way of, calculating it. And this has been done by SEPT. They did it in the Surat Sejal's work. And what I really want you to focus here on is that if you see this figure, that, if you earn 3.75 lakh per year, then you can afford a house of 15 lakhs. Now, who in the, and the way we define EWS is that up to 3 lakhs, you know. So this 15 lakh house is not for the people, who are into the EWS category. So we established in the beginning that the shortage lies within EWS and LIG category. They are the one who are not able to get it. But the subsidy that we are giving, it is actually going to someone who can afford a 15 lakh house, and that particular 15 lakh house is not catering to the EWS section. So I would say in the public housing, the subsidies that one is giving is actually not reaching the target group and filling up that bridge, that void that you have in the EWS and LIG section. So this is something I would really like to understand, that who are the people who are supplying for EWS and LIG section. They are definitely not giving housing at the price of 15 lakhs or 10 lakhs. They are giving housing at a much lesser rate. And how can they give at a much lesser rate? What is the secret then? So I think that is what we need to figure it out. Yeah, please. Getting back to the Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, which is a public program, and public housing caters to a very minuscule part of the housing need. It is less than 10%. But the entire discussion usually surrounds the public housing, because that sets a trend, that gives us some data to understand. Now, when this program was launched in 2015, and now in 2020, 20, ARSC got added to this particular mission also. So what we see that, which is the vertical that had the maximum traction, and what we find, the maximum traction came from BLC, beneficiary led construction. When the person said, I have a land, please give me the subsidy so that I can construct my housing on the top of that. So it remained a housing thing. It never grew up or extended to a settlement planning. But that's fine. Even if we can have some scope for improvement there, what didn't happen at all is in situ slum upgrading. There was no takers for that. There was no takers, not so much on this affordable housing in partnership, but BLC was a great success, because it was the one that people just do it, and that kind of reconfirms that it's people who build for themselves. It is never that they go out and buy a house, or it's people who build for themselves. I think it reconfirms our understanding that auto construction is the way to go forward. So this is another thing that it gives us quite a good lead that we need to understand um, out of these four verticals. Yeah, please. This particular point that I was trying to make one slide before is that how the subsidies are calculated. So we make some assumptions that this is the house for 300,000 or 3 lakhs. Um, how much is coming as a subsidy, how much the beneficiary is giving. All these things that we are understanding as a subsidy calculation. But I would say that is this 3 lakh, this assumption that 3 lakh is a housing unit construction, we may need to do a further disaggregation of that data. How do you arrive at this 3 lakh? What exactly is the understanding? This 3 lakh is the assumption that land is free. The land is there. It's either under possession or it's under, you have the land, only you spend 3 lakhs just to now build the house. Now, if that is the case, then this 15 lakh house that we just talked about, then what is it? Like the rest 12 lakh is only for the land. So that is what I think we are getting. I'm getting to that point. It's a land cost, which is the breaking or making. It's not the dwelling cost. The 3 lakh can be reduced further to how much? 2 lakhs, 1.5 lakh. But we are talking about lakhs in few lakhs here. But when the land cost, that is the major chunk. If you can resolve that, then I think we have a way forward. Yeah, Arpan, please. So this is what the argument I'm trying to make here is that it's a cost of the land that is the breaking or making point, not so much on the housing unit cost, because that is still a manageable point. So because what we were calculating is that how much you spend per square foot cost, 1,200 rupees per square foot for a decent construction. How much can you now reduce that 1,200? You can reduce it to say 800, 700. How much would you reduce? But still you would be cutting by 1 lakh or maximum 2 lakhs. But the main cost is the land cost. And if you are not able to do that, I think that's where we are not asking the right question. The land question, I think, is the prime question. The other things can be resolved and has been resolved by many. Yeah, please. So now I give a few ideas that I'm just going to be throwing for your considerations. Is that why the land cost is so high in India? What is it? The Indian cities, if you compare the land cost of Indian cities and to the global developed world, actually it is comparable. So is it that our land in urban areas yield gold or diamonds that we are so costly? Or is it something else? Sometimes the market, if you have a market that is opaque, that is dysfunctional, the cost goes up. But if you have the demand and supply in a tandem, then the cost actually is, it's being lowered. And I would like to draw analogy here. Like, for example, there was a time in 80s or late 80s when in Delhi, if you want to get a landline, you have to go at 4 o'clock in the morning to the minister's house with a flower bouquet and say that, please give me a phone, please give me a phone. My mother is ill, my parents are old, like so much of drama on that. But now, who cares for landline? We have 1,000 other options, and you just click and you get your phone and you are connected. So the idea is to getting connected and not so much of this landline as such. So I think competition is something that brings the pricing down. So now the land is actually so regulated and so controlled that the land prices in Indian cities is unimaginable. It is something that I think we need to all sit up and say that why this land piece of pixel of land in Mumbai is costing so much. Is it that there is no land, or is this crisis being created for the market, for the rent seeking? We do not know. So I think that is something that needs to be done. And here I identify one point is that, we have two parallel trajectory going and they are not meeting. One trajectory is this land administration who are not part of the urban spatial discourse. So the spatial planner does this allocation of functions to the land, and by virtue of doing that, the land prices go up and down. But then there is land administration, who is the custodian of the land, does not want to engage with this particular discipline, or there is no scope for them to, um, you know, um engage, and their systems are so, what you say, is so kind of a, it's like a big juggernaut, which is so difficult to move, and that is where I think that things go a bit messy. And we did some work on that, and we figured out that if you want to get, and we have this deed registration system, we do not have conclusive titling, we have presumptive titling. I think the tenure issue and everything is a very complex. So, upon if you go to the next slide, I personally feel that till the time we resolve this land administration system and spatial planning, their juxtaposition, that may move us a bit more ahead. And this is what we did. If you want to kind of get your name mutated after the death of your parents, if you want to get your name done on your land, you have to go through these processes. And if you have to go through these processes, imagine a urban poor who does not have any clue about administration complexities. How can they do it? And so what we found, that many of the urban poor who were entitled for BLC, but they could not get the subsidy just because they could not establish that they have the land title, and they are the owner of the land. They have the land, they are sitting there, but they are not able to establish that with the de jure paper. So to cut it short, or to make it a more succinct, is that urban discourse and the land administration, I think they need to be working together. They are still not part of each other, and I think that is where a big gap is there. It is building up. There are many professionals who are working on it, but from the spatial planning side, I think um, we need to really take it forward, and spatial planning people need to understand this, because land administration is done usually by bureaucrats who are there as a district collector from the very beginning of their career. Spatial planners learn this thing much later, if they have interest in this boring so-called processes. So I think this is where we need to also do a capacity building. Yeah. Next, please. So, how the affordable housing and city statutory plannings are linked. Now, if you see, this is the place where we got very fascinated. This is a Google image from Berhampur in Odisha, and 30% of Berhampur is under this linear plots. So what happens? You inherit the land, and because you are from a trader community, you decide that I need the frontage. So you slice it in a way that everyone, like the three brothers, would get the frontage. Now the three brothers, when they become six, they still say we need the frontage. So we would cut it again, slice it in a way that I get this, what you call linear plots. This also is a phenomena in southern Andhra. Also, I found something like this in Nepal. So these linear plots are like, say, 10 meters in the beginning and in the on the front, and 50 meters. It's like a train. Um, so the plots are not having sunlight inside the middle of the plot, and that's the way it is being done. And when you discuss this thing, somebody says it's a cultural issue. Someone says this is the way people are, people know the best and they should do that. And in the city planning, these areas are not included because it's a people who has this ambiguous ownership, and it's too complex, and let's not touch it. But I feel that that this is where we are going wrong, because if you do not have an habitat that gets sunlight, and you cannot build a house that would be like, safe and also healthy, how can you give public subsidy for that? One is putting so much of effort in saying that show me your de jure paper that you own this land. But then we are giving a public subsidy to a house which is only 6 feet wide and making this train kind of a house. You know, I think, one can also question on it that how can you give public subsidy to a house that is not healthy, that is not conforming to the national building standards. So I think these are the issues that we also need to talk about it, that how do we resolve this kind of alimonies that we have, and how the sanitary planning processes should use their instruments to address this kind of areas. So can we do a land pooling here? Can we do an amalgamation here? Can we do the reblocking here? Do we have enough capacity to do such things? Is this something that is being identified by the as a mandate by the municipal corporation, or shall we just keep our eyes shut on that? So it is not making the building, it's not only making the dwelling unit, but it's also the neighborhood that counts. So somewhere I think we are looking at affordable housing only from the pricing point of view and only from the housing unit point of view. But we have to also just go a bit higher level and look into it as a city-wide level, and also from the city's perspective. What kind of a green spaces are we providing? What kind of, a microclimate that we are producing? Yeah. Urban, next point. I think it takes a time to the next slide to come because of this lag. Hi, Arpan, is it happening? I'm not sure. I'm sorry that it got stuck, it seems.
Is
Um,
Arpan having some issues? And while we wait, should we tackle some of the questions?
yeah, sure, sure, sure.
Yeah, so we'll wait for him to set it up. It's been quite fascinating, and I learned a lot of things myself from this. It's great you touched upon and shared all this data on this beneficiary led construction, right? Which is the area where we as Habitat also think, there is good scope, and, this land being available, as you also pointed out in this case of the laborers who had to leave because there was no stake, right? Owning land gives a lot of stake for people, and that makes a whole lot of things quite interesting. So there were a bunch of questions. One was on this PIR ratio. The question was, is it a standard that sort of uniformly adopted by everyone, or are people among the various agencies define it differently?
No, see, basically, Deepak Parekh committee has set up a standard, and this is based on the global, work that they did. That for us, the EWS should be like 3 times. That is something that is comfortable. So, what that particular slide I showed you is taken 4 times. So it's basically 3 to 5. So you can take either 3 or 4 or 5. So that is the PIA ratio that one is taking, and then establishing the pricing of part of it. But I would say this is only for statistical reason and only for doing it a kind of a ballpark figure. See, there's a distinct difference between this urban poverty and the rural poverty. So urban poverty, where you do not have your social, network, you do not have your medical covered. So one push and you are, down to the, you know, critical poverty. So this is only for calculation and only for making a ballpark figure. But when you do not have a steady income and you say that, okay, I would be able to pay every month this thing, and if a crisis hit, like either illness or say marriage or something like that happens in the family, then you again go a bit lower, no? So it should be also, I think, what we do not have is that looking at it also from the other social and anthropological part of it, the behavior part of it. We are calculating it more on a economic thing, which is also important just to get a sense of it, what should be the pricing. So the argument that I'm making is that, the even in a city like Surat, if the price of the flat is housing is 15 lakhs, this is, and the developer who is producing 15 lakh housing and supplying, he or she is not catering to the economically weaker section. They are having a very different market. That is what I'm saying.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it is very nuanced. And, the examples you gave made me think of education as a sector also, where there was a lot of focus on numbers first, and then it gets more nuanced into quality, right, rather than just focus on the numbers. So we have Arpan back with the next slide. Do we
Yeah.
want to move along or
I
take?
just finish it. I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
finish it. So
Makes sense. Yeah.
what the point that I'm trying to make is that the focus should be on um, supplying developed land in the city. I think the focus should be on that. I think not much work has been done on that part, but it's the supply of housing units becomes the key question. And if we rephrase our question and then we say that, okay, why there is not enough land? Is it because our lands are so inherently so expensive, or is it something more than that? Okay, so that is a question we have to do. um, and the next part of it is that, if I learn from the global experiences, just 1 second, please, just 1 second. So I think this is
Aparna, you are on mute.
I'm
Yeah.
saying, we
Aparna, wait, I have asked you to unmute.
Yeah, sorry. So what I just want to, these are last couple of slides that, what we have studied to an extent is that how the spatial planning instruments are being used to unlock land for cities. So this has been the reforms that has been taken in Chile, Colombia, all Latin American countries, the recent one being Ecuador, where it has happened. And what are the instruments that they have used? They have used these instruments of zoning that we also have, but we have not used it to unlock the land. And another thing is that, like giving land the status of a social function. That land is having a social function, and land is not like any other commodity which is to be traded at the best price. I think that is another ideological or philosophical position that one has to take, that if it has a social function, then how does this particular asset needs to be used and is to be conceptualized. Because if one conceptualizes land as a commodity, as a trading thing, and we say, okay, the best price, if I get it, I sell it to that person, that is one way of thinking. But it is a common resource, and if it is a common resource, it has a social function. Then how do we get the best value for it? And when I say best valued, I do not mean only the economic value, but other values. Maybe it makes inclusiveness, it makes the cities more just. So I think that those are the also values that we need to bring in. And if we do that, then the conceptualization of land is very different. Okay, so then next is then we will quickly take the questions. I think there are some interesting questions also coming up. So I think I just spoke about it, that it's a land that is important. It's also that people are not all dying in cities to own a house. There are other options of living, and that has been also become quite apparent. But this is not being talked about. But I think Government of India has really taken few steps further on that. The involvement of the Revenue Department or the Land Administration and spatial planning, I think that needs to get a bit more synergy. And last point that I want to say is that there is a scope for the private sector, for the startups, for the entrepreneurs to get into this, that how do they merge it. It should not be become like a kind of a sterile or kind of a exercise that I'm just doing mapping. But I'm doing mapping for what? I'm doing mapping and how I am integrating with the urban planning. I think that are the things that we need to discuss. So technology and capacity, these two are the key things that would make or break our cities. It's happening, but it is not happening in a way that is giving us this thing that we are making inclusive cities, and we are having cities which has a social function. I think that is the discussion that we have to take it forward. So there's a lot happening on the mapping part of it, but mapping for what and for whom and for what purpose? I think those things, I think maybe from the governance side also we need to discuss. So I stop here. I hope I have not taken more time, but I think we can now then take up the questions. Yeah, please. Thank
Sure,
you.
sure.
Thanks
Yeah.
for your patience and listening to me.
No, there are lots of very interesting questions. So, we did the survey on who are the audience and right, and what is the interest in the topic. Half of them said their interest is urban development, and the other interests were smart cities and sustainable development, right? So that's the interest of the group. So, we can focus more on the urban aspects of it. And I had also asked if people thought will urbanization as a problem get worse, right, given there's also the climate change and other aspects thrown into it. Two-thirds felt yes. Nobody felt it would be the same, right? They just felt things would either get much worse. More people felt it would get much worse. And some said, look, with more remote work and right, there is this feeling that everyone need not be crowded, and crowding has its other effects. Things could get better. So I think there is a little bit of optimism also in that, just to give a flavor
Yeah,
for
yeah,
the
sure, sure.
feedback from the crowd. So there were a bunch of questions. I'll try to group them, because then we can handle the topics if not the specific question. uh, One is on the financing aspect of it, right? So what are your thoughts on finance availability for urban slum kind of places where land titles are not easy to get? And also, how can social entrepreneurs try to use, make all of this accessible, right, be it in the rental housing or in the construction space, through the financing, and right, try to see if there are opportunities there.
Okay, so I think what we need to recognize that we are operating in cities of like Indian cities where 90% people are employed informally. I think we need to, we write it in the reports. There is a ILO report. There are work done by Arjun Sengupta long back. There's still some work happening on that. But somewhere, we have this uh, wild optimism, I would say, that tomorrow we are all going to get formalized. No, then the moment we get formalized, it's like a informal and formal. So there is a binary, you know, and once I'm formalized, I will get all the credits. Now these are things that has been uh, proven wrong for long years. That even if you get formal, you still will not get credit because of your social background, because where you stay, because of your dressing, because of your assets that you have. So, like the way you speak, these are many factors the bank say. So, what needs to change? Shall we try to change this, making everybody informal to formal? Is that so? Because 90% is a big number. Or we should change the way credits are given, the agencies who are giving the credits. We can also change that. If you look at the traditional banking sector, they have their own constraints. They have to also, they can give a non-performing loan to a highly business tycoon, but then, like those things would be a problem for them also. But I'm just saying, when you have this many people, and you want to give them loan, then this banking has to change, not the other part. Now, we have to also understand, how this other part are accessing credits. It's not that they are not accessing credits; they are accessing credits. How are they accessing credits? Do we have enough knowledge on that? Everybody says, "Oh, I took it from my own family member." May not be true. In the family member, there is a money lender who is some way or the other connected. No, so they say मेरा चाचा है, but वो चाचा शायद established money lender ही है. He is a money lender, but he is also related to them. Why is he trusts them to give money? Because he knows that he will get it back. So all I'm trying to say, the banking sector has to also figure it out that this is not their cup of tea. So they need to have other agencies which would do this task, which is operating on trust, operating on social networks, operating on other things. So there does exist a system, and we all know about it in our own day-to-day life. Where does the maid borrows money from? From the house they work. And why do they give it? Because there's a mutual relationship, there's a social contract there. So all I'm saying is that we should not. My understanding is that it's not going to happen that India would become 90% from, people would start working in the formal sector. It's not going to happen. Even if that happens, they are not going to get credits. So the people who are giving them money, we have to change our modus, our way of operating, and those changes are welcome. And I think NHP is doing some, as it's not that nothing has been done. There has been some moves made by them. So this is what I I would say. So financing is a big issue. Is access to credit is a big issue. Even in implementing PLC, that was one of the challenges, because there is a gap funding. See, this the subsidy that they are getting is not enough to construct the house. They always needed to do the gap funding, and that was the issue. Yeah, I hope I have
Okay,
answered your
so
question.
this question is a bit on the linking the pandemic and also the another part of it was on the PPP models, right? So do you see any changes in the way the problem of housing, be it in the urban areas and now maybe because of this reverse migration, which may or may not be as we originally thought it is, changed the perception of the need and the models that are required to enable housing, right? In the housing in the pandemic context.
I think pandemic has made one thing very clear, that employment and the way people are employed needs to be understood in a much more detail, in a much more nuanced manner. Entering this housing discourse only through housing lens, I think is a kind of a wrong assumption, or it's a kind of a misleading assumption. We should enter it through the livelihood or economic part of it. Even if you have the house, you locked the house and you went away, because you cannot sustain in a city like Delhi without working anywhere. See, when you earn a money, then only you can pay the rent. You can if you do not have it, and this is also true for the middle class in Delhi who do not have a house here. You cannot live in the city paying such huge rent and not having an incoming flow of money. So all I'm saying is that if we really want to address the housing issue, we have to address the economic part of it, the employment part of it, and why those areas are there and what is their economic productivity. If it is being so economically productive, why do not we use the zoning laws and give it a special status, and then say, give them water, give them sanitation, make them more healthy. That's it. That is what you have to do. Otherwise, how can you start making houses for all these people and take them again 15 kilometers away where they don't want to go, and spend the entire energy of the administration on just going on relocating? It doesn't work. It will not work. It has not worked anywhere in the world, actually. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So, allied to that is this, models that may work, and one of the participant talks about, right, how this whole idea of giving this EWS, right, some allocation when development is done and land is given by the government, and then they take these TDRs and, right, give these houses outside the city, which where no one wants to live in, right? So things have, many things have been tried, and many have not worked. So your thoughts on what may be some ways that will entice developers to, right, be part of the solution?
I think the perception of the are two things that I would like to highlight here. People are in cities, especially the big cities or the class one cities. People are not, the urban poor are not making their own housing, like the imagination that we have, like the John F.C. Turners, like people are building their own housing and they are, it is not true. They are accessing housing already built by someone. They may be extending a room or something like that, but they are not with their own hands, they are not building housing. Who are these suppliers? Who are these suppliers and how they can supply housing at such a cheap cost? My assumption is, and we are doing a research on that, my assumption is that they are able to apply this thing because they have this socially negotiated contract of getting the land at a zero rate or a negligible. Now, how do they get that? And if we now, anyway, they are getting it, if we now institutionalize it and say that land is having social function, and this is my sanitary plan, and I say that this is, anyway, you are doing it, let me institutionalize it. And let me just give you the water and sanitation so that you can be also peaceful and you be there. I think this is something that we have to deal with it. And the private developer, we have to engage them, but we have to also tell them that land is not like any other commodity. It is a social function, has a social function. So you have to operate like this. So if you do this, your profit there, you have to also invest here in the not so profitable area. And there, the public hand has to play their role. And this has been done in other countries. It's not something that I'm saying something very new. It has been done in other countries, and there's a learning from that. That why we think that this is like you can just go on making profit, but not and go on crying that I'm not making enough profit. What is the profit that you need to make? 30% on your investment return? Like what is it, or what is the figure that you have to have? So I think that is also something the public hand has to then make the regulations and encourage them to be part of it, but then not free for all also, no. So that's also something we have to and that is a commitment the public hand has to do, not any one of us.
Okay, so we just have 2 minutes. So I'll just ask a quick question based on a comment that came in. The comment was on, the whole idea of governance and, right, people putting access to housing and, right, letting the rich, middle class and the poor all sort of coexist as a part of the city. Do you see that in the smart cities concept, or, right, where does that play a role in the smart cities concept?
For me, the smart city is that we are smart if we do not end up in having half of our or more than half of our population living in congestion, like what I showed you. That is being very unsmart. No, 80% of the people are living in congestion. That's being very unsmart. So I think we can go on inventing new levels of smart city and smart cities, risk informed cities. So there are many levels that keeps coming, and I think that's part of our vocation, that we have to find new levels. But I think bottom line is that our cities needs to be just. That's it. It cannot exist if you are not just, because that is not economically productive. It is also not sustainable in every ways. It is not sustainable, so there would be a other kind of resistance then. So just to tell you, it's a very difficult question you asked me, but I'm just thinking that it is not smart like this. The smartness has to be demonstrated in some numbers also. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, these are, very interesting questions, and, for which there are no easy answers. And, we are out of time, though there are so many questions and comments and discussions. In the interest of time, because, Willgrow has a tight schedule to move on. Thank you so much, Aparna. It was so fascinating.
Yeah.
So much more to talk, but I will hand the floor back to Willgrow now. Thank you.
Thanks, Meera, for moderating this. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Aparna, for sharing your expertise on this topic. And Meera, it was really great to have you with us in this masterclass. With the interaction that was happening with the audience, I'm sure the participants feel very much the same. Coming up next, we have a session around awareness and accessibility of health for underserved women, challenges and innovation opportunities, and a masterclass on tech solutions for incubators. You can also meet Harshit and Anvita from Kalari Capital and Arvind from Deepak Fertilizers and Smart Chem Technologies in the Networking Lounge. Thanks to all who joined us for this session, and see you all again soon.
Yeah, and special thanks to Arpan for supporting me. And it's just sometimes, this technology, I get kind of a bit flabbergasted. Thank you. Thank you very much, Meera. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.